Welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith, and I've got a very special guest today. I have John Waugh, who was a member of the original Magpie group that helped take Newcastle United over from a regime that was certainly only interested in spending the family silver and helped develop Newcastle into the entertainers and a team which was always competing for Europe. Hi, John, how are you?
Hello. Yeah, very well. Thank you, Steve.
Great, thanks for coming on, John. Great to have you as a guest, and obviously with the club in the middle of a takeover, it felt apt to get somebody on who was a member of the Magpie group, which did so much good for our football club. And I just really want to you let the people who are watching today know a little bit about your early days and your background, John, before we start looking at Newcastle.
Well, I grew up in Shire in a pit village. It was a pit village at that time. Started an apprenticeship in the shipyards and became a marine fitter and building ship engines.
Yeah.
When I was 23, I'd been playing in groups in the 60s then. But at 23, I'd married, had my first child. So I actually became self-employed, and here I am all many years later, still self-employed. So that's essentially, it's a lot of detail, but not really needed about this. That's essentially what happened in those days.
You're a big Newcastle United fan. What was your first Newcastle United match, John?
Well, that was actually after the 52 Cup final in the season 52-53, and I was taken by my uncle. My father, unfortunately, at that time in life, had a very bad accident in the pit, and the damage to his spine prevented him from standing for long periods. So it was his brother, my uncle, who took me for the very first time. And what an experience. But I don't need to tell people about that. Many people have got exactly the same experience. And the excitement that starts to reverberate through your body at that age when you see the first game. Unbelievable magic.
Obviously, you said 52. Did you manage to get to the 55 Cup final? Were you lucky enough to be able to go to that?
No, I wasn't. Well, at 10-year-old, the family finances just didn't support things like that at that time. So, with being son of a pitman, there wasn't any money for that sort of thing. But I listened to it on the radio, and at that time, again, that was the medium that people saw. It was not until much later in the 60s when televised games were becoming more common. But that was the entry into the fanaticism that we all have. 52. Favourite football at that time, although I loved Jackie Milburn, was Jimmy Schooler.
Right.
What a player. What a player. Even today, I rarely see anybody with the tenacity in midfield and the passing. His daisy cut passes to Bobby Mitchell were absolutely fantastic, and that is the early memories that forever I look back on.
Yeah.
Magic days.
Hard to believe, isn't it, really? And we'll come to this, I'm sure, as we progress through the conversation, that, I bet as a kid, Newcastle winning the Cup in 51, 52 and then 55, you thought that was the way it was always going to be. But here we sit in 2020, John. Still haven't won an FA Cup.
That was my expectations. I used to say to me dad, are we out of the cup this year? It was just an unbelievable, having lived through, although I didn't get there till 52. It was just an amazing thing that every year I expected we would be in the final again. Not so much the league, because the glory days for our supporters then was the 50s Cup finals. Magic. Yeah.
1969, of course, saw us, get to the Cup final, and Joe Harvey, who of course had skippered Newcastle those glorious FA Cup wins, was now the manager, and an amazing period. I'm presuming you must have got to a few of those games, in the build-up.
I went to all of them. I didn't manage to get to the European matches, as I did much later on. But I was at them all. I mean, unbelievable, the matches, and again, memories very, very distant, unfortunately, of success. And that was the first success for me as a supporter, the Fairs Cup. Unfortunately, the final was away, but by then we could see it on the telly, so we had the benefits of that then. But very, very disappointing that from the 50s, for my first match, we had to wait till 69 before we actually won another cup. Incredible. Yeah. And we actually got in the back door for that cup because we didn't finish high enough, and it was the one city rule that got us in.
That's right. The early 70s, promised a great deal, and Joe Harvey, of course, was still the manager. Newcastle got to the FA Cup final in 74, lost sadly to Liverpool comprehensively by 3-0, and then obviously got to the League Cup final, our only appearance in that, in 1976, again losing to a wonder goal by Dennis Stewart. We had Mick Mahoney actually on the show earlier this week talking about that final and that goal. But after that, we entered a period and a long period of discontent, John.
Well, actually getting to the finals of 74 and then the League Cup one, I began to believe we were going to start again as we did in the 50s. Not necessarily the league again, but I began to believe we were, and then of course it all went wrong again. And that was the period that I became political. And I eventually joined up with Malcolm Dix, Alan Rooney, Peter Ratcliffe, and we started the Newcastle Supporters Association. Not a lot of people realise this, but there was the early signs of finance coming through lottery money. There wasn't a lottery at that time, but Malcolm had good contacts, and although it was very secretive, they had decided that the charity part of their lottery, if they did manage to launch it, which was going to be a sports-based, would come to the Newcastle Supporters Association. And we were quite excited about that. It didn't work out, unfortunately, but we launched quite a few challenges to the board at that time. There was the famous extraordinary meeting that we called with Lord Westwood publicly announcing that it would be over in 5 minutes. In fact, it went on for 2.5 hours. And even then, they were lucky that they got away with it. We'd done a lot of work. And a person that was there at the time, I don't know if this was covered very well in the press, was the biggest shareholder in the club, which was George Dixon. Now, I'd become very, very close to his two cousins, and they elected to support us, which was one of the sort of shocks that Lord Westwood got. And in the meeting, George Dixon had given his proxy to the board. But because his cousins had been trying to persuade him, and then we talked to him at the meeting, he decided to switch his vote. Now, that would have actually killed Lord Westwood's success, because it would have taken away his major votes and given us the victory. And I couldn't believe that the stewards, in a public company meeting, because technically that's what the club was, refused to withdraw his proxy. Now, at any shareholders meeting, a shareholder's physical vote always overrides a proxy, but they refused. And unfortunately, George was a very quiet man, so he didn't fight a lot against it. But unfortunately, that victory was as close as that on that night. Some dramas that have been quite amazing to live through.
The battle for United has become, a part of our history now, and it's a proud part of our history, because it was, from those early days that you and Malcolm had, started off. That's where the, whole Magpie group really was growing from. It was like a phoenix rising from the flames. So let's look at that and look at how you managed to get John Hall on board, Sir John Hall, as he is now, of course, and someone who was an entrepreneur, a great orator, and somebody who had obviously, done very well with his business and was obviously setting up the Metro Centre in Gateshead, the biggest shopping centre in Europe. So, Newcastle, as I said, was in the doldrums. The club was going nowhere. There was accusations from supporters that the board were using the money as the family silver. They showed Waddle, Gascoigne and Beardsley, which really annoyed fans. And younger supporters were starting to get annoyed and setting up their own kind of, objections towards the club. United Supporters for Change, I remember starting off with some great guys involved. Brian Williams, who's sadly no longer with us, and Tony Fiddis was involved in that. Colin Whittle, amazing. But in the background, yourself, Malcolm Dix and others were starting to get a very, very important set of men together, businessmen, to take it to the next level.
Well, John was the key. To be honest, after the fights that we had with Lord Westwood and the later people that replaced him, we pretty much knew that the only way through was someone coming along with a lot of money and willing to spend it, or at least spend enough to switch the power. And of course, when John did come along, what a phenomenal impact he had. And his oration really hasn't been praised for the effect it had on the whole of the Northeast. It was quite amazing. But underneath that, of course, it was the money. Now, the problem that initially we had was that John didn't want to buy the club. He didn't want to own it. He wanted the fans to own it. And that was a premise that later many people, spoke very negatively about his motives. And his motives were very surely not to particularly personally own the club. Didn't want to do that. But we did eventually get to a point where the trust that John had in Malcolm, myself, Peter Radcliffe, Alan Rooney, etc., because there was a small group of people that actually worked at the enterprise all of the time, and that was where the actual battle was won, underlined by John's public leadership and his money, of course, when it got to the point. And it of course, it wasn't the Magpie Group or John who first started buying shares. There was an offer that was constructed and put into the press of that he would go along with, but I had gone on holiday to come back to find that what Gordon McKeegan had done, he had taken the records from early disputes that we had and targeted the shareholders that supported us and went and bought up a lot of their shares. That was such a huge blow to find that, we had to actually start from that point. And I remember thinking, because John rang each of us and said, look, we'll recover from this. We will recover. Take strength. We will recover. And I remember thinking, well, we'll recover, but it just depends on how much money you're willing to spend, because the routes then were a lot less open, because the shareholders we'd always been able to rely on weren't there. And then we started, and then that really was a shares war, and it went on and on and on. But we never ever gave up. And you've got to understand, it was difficult for John because he got a lot of anti-press that, were always accusing him of personal gains that he was after. And that was never, ever the premise. In fact, on several occasions, we had to make sure that because of family pressure, we bolstered up his support and made sure he was okay. But whenever there was any public need to come out and say things, John was magnificent with that. And the bulk of the supporters were behind him.
How did you get John Hall on board?
The original incident that turned him on was a session he had with a journalist that unfortunately is now passed away, and they sat down with a bottle of whiskey, and at the end of it, John made a very great and excellent article for this journalist to print, and it came out in the Sunday Mail, I think it was, the next day. And really, in the way that the journalist had concocted the whole article, it really meant John was launched into it. And of course, there was a surge of business people that got behind him. And I think it was Austin Signs who came up with the name the Magpie Group, and that got picked up by the press, and that was the name. And then it started to roll on. John created an office for us to work from in the Metro Centre, and that was termed the War Room. And we used to have charts around the walls and showing where the shareholders lay and things like that. And of course, there was restricted access into that room because it was there on the walls, and we used to have targets of how we'd go about and go and get the shareholders. But there was a lot of pressure on John, and it was very important that we made sure whenever he looked our way, he saw an absolute resolute support that he got from us. And we passed on many of the goodwill things that people had said to us when we managed to buy up shares and their families. So that helped a lot.
Of course, the journalist you were thinking of there was the late great Bob Cass.
That's right.
Top man, and sorely missed by everybody who follows Newcastle United and those people who obviously cover Newcastle as well. The club did eventually launch a share scheme under a little bit of duress, and John Hall had managed to get into the football club and work alongside the board who were there at that time. Were you surprised at the lack of response by supporters to the share scheme? Because, a lot of supporters have been crying out for it, but very few put their hand in their pocket when it was offered to them.
Well, I'll be very honest with you. It was not our share issue. It was a share issue that was constructed by Gordon McKeegan and the other directors, quite simply because they had no other choice. They were going to go bankrupt, and their share issue was not a share issue that I was enthusiastic on. But because John had actually joined the board then, and he was strongly of the opinion we couldn't be seen to be going against it. So we all had to get behind it. But I don't think that we had the chemistry in our enthusiasm that we would have had it been our share issue. And I think that chemistry is exactly what was missing and why people didn't take it up. I mean, we couldn't come out and say that. And John was very keen to publicly show that we would try that on, but that shareholder issue was not one that I personally or any of the other working Magpie Group members were keen on.
You mentioned that you had to go around and basically speak to people who held the shares and try and make them offers. I mean, what was that process like? Was it difficult? And who had the biggest success rate?
You mean personally?
Yeah, I mean, was it difficult? Did you find it difficult speaking to people about it? Because it's like an older way of doing things. Now this takeover is all being played out in the public. It's lawyers are making lots of money out of it. It's in the press. This is a completely different type of takeover that you went through. And it always fascinates me that people had these individual shares, whether it was a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker living in Newcastle. And, you guys were heroes in the sense that you were the ones who had to go out and try and persuade these people to sell them. And I'm sure there was some very easy wins, but I can imagine there would have been a few older ones who were very, annoyed about this and didn't want to do it. So what was the process like, and who had the most success in getting the shares, do you think?
Well, there's no doubt that because I worked 24/7, I managed to get more than anyone else, and getting George Dixon, and eventually getting the other director, who was the vice chairman at the time, getting his. That was very satisfying. However, I have to look back and say it was one of the most enjoyable times of my life, because at heart I'm a salesman, and I sold the vision that John had put together to people all over the country. It wasn't just in Newcastle. These shares were in Southampton, they were in Bristol, they were in the Isle of Wight, they were in Scotland. These family shares had moved all over the country, and there were many what is termed missing shareholders, and these people weren't even aware that they had shares, but they'd just been passed down, and they were 3-4 generations down and weren't even aware of it. And we had one of these companies that they trace family for inheritance. There's a main one that's on the telly. I can't remember the name now.
No, I can't.
We actually employed them, and they used to ring up every day and give us carte blanche about the people that currently owned them.
Right.
And the stories that are around them, it would take a book to tell you about them, but I can give you some indication of the shares. There was one in particular that they rang up one day and they said, Mr. So-and-so, and we located him on the share list. He has such and such shares here, but he has an aunt so-and-so who was deceased and he inherited them. And that happened about 4 times. This guy had his own shares, but he had about 4 or 5 deceased family members wherein he was the only living person in that family. So he inherited them, but didn't know about them. And they gave his address, his name and address, and the telephone number. And when I got the telephone number, I said, no, you've missed some digits. You've missed some digits. And they said, no, we haven't. And I said, yeah, but it's only 3 digits. And they said, ring it. And I rang it with the code, and it rang. And I thought, where the hell is that? And it was in some weird part of Wales that only had a 3-digit phone number.
Right.
So anyway, I rang that number for 3 or 4 months every day. And it just rang out and rang out and rang out. And then one day, I nearly shit myself. Sorry.
That's all right. It's okay.
When somebody picked the phone up, and I was a bit gobsmacked and a little not knowing what to say. Anyway, I started to get my speech back and started to explain. And he obviously was a very well set up man with good manners, and he said, "Oh yes, I've got this certificate for my shares." Now at that point in time, I didn't tell him about the other ones, and this was at a time when the shares were at probably the highest value, and I explained, because he obviously hadn't been in the country, which is why his phone didn't get answered. And I said, we're actually buying up these shares at the moment. Would you be interested in selling? And he said, well, how much are you willing to offer? And when I told him the current amount, I heard him gasp. And he said, can you meet me today? I'll come with my solicitor. And I said, well, where? And he said, well, Manchester Airport's the most, even place between where we are.
Yeah.
Can we meet this afternoon? And I said, let me come back to you. So I rang John, and John said, get to Teesside, you go on the plane. So they actually flew me down to Manchester Airport. Now, what the guy didn't know is he'd also inherited about 4 other people's shares. So the amount that he was getting was a very substantial amount. But he then went on to get another 4 or 5 similar amounts. And I was frightened in case the guy was going to have a heart attack, because when we were there in the airport, we got a special room that his solicitor managed to get. And I took his documents out of the briefcase, and we got them all signed up. And then I said, do you remember an aunt, whatever her name was? And he said, oh, yes. I can't remember how long ago she died. And I said, well, she had some shares and you've inherited them. This went on, and he was absolutely staggered. And we got, because there were individual estates, and I don't know if you're aware of it, but the shares for the first 10 had 1 vote per share. And thereafter, for every 5, you had 1 vote. So 15 votes had 15 shares had 11 votes. But this guy had 10 votes, then his aunt had 10 votes, and then the other aunts had 7 votes, and so on and so on. So we got a lump of shares where every share had a vote. So that was a huge step forward. And there was great excitement when we were doing the totals of the shares the next day. And of course, everyone else was jumping in. Malcolm managed to get every single share that the Westwood family had. And that ended up with being, again, an expanded lot of votes. It was a fantastic time, great excitement, and lots of drama.
What was that moment like when you knew that you'd finally succeeded in helping Sir John and the rest of the Magpie group take the club over?
Well, there was euphoria the day that we got George Dixon's. And I met George about 3 or 4 times before the build-up to it. I knew, and he knew, that he was going to sell. But he wanted to go through a process where he could have a clear conscience that he'd done every possible attempt he could to offer them to the board, fully knowing that Gordon McKee didn't have the money and was grasping at straws trying to raise money to buy them. But he never got near it all. And the day that we did, George had organised so that he wasn't at the home that he used at that time, because the press just swamped that place. But I'll tell you something about George Dixon. He was the biggest shareholder in the club, and that had been passed down from his father. And he obviously was a director at the time. He resigned the day before he sold his shares. But the very next match that we played was a Wednesday night, midweek in the winter, and George was at that match standing in the Gallagher in the rain because he was a really true supporter. Sorry about that. Sorry about that.
Don't worry, John. Don't worry.
Yeah. So that was the time when that happened. We all knew, and we were all euphoric that that was the end, but it was only in sight.
Yeah.
Because the press all the time had harassed us and harassed John all the time. When are you going to call an AGM? And my answer every time was, when we've won. That's when we'll call it, when we've won. And we are getting closer and closer. The next director was the one that really did kill it all. But there was a time before that, and you've got to remember that John had a house in Portugal, which they used quite a lot because his business was very pressurized. You know, he really was chased off his feet lots of times just for business.
Yeah.
And he went off to Portugal, and I had an idea at that time that I'm pretty sure that John wouldn't agree to. And he wouldn't have agreed to it because he didn't believe any family should suffer badly from the actions of trying to buy this club. And there were times when the McKee family could have been badly hurt, and John refused. But I had a process in mind that I thought, if I go and talk to Douglas, I'd probably get away with doing this new form of the shares war, and John was away. So I did. John went off to Portugal, and I went to see Douglas, and I put this proposition to him. And I'd hardly finished, and he said, "You go and do that now. The old fella's away. We can't talk to him at the minute. He's, you know, not in contact. Go and do it now." And the process that I put to him was that we stop buying shares that were in shareholders' hands and start buying out directors instead. And I had a formula to do that. And the formula was, which is what I didn't want to put to John because I thought he might refuse, that we would go to a director, and I had a one in mind, and we would offer the highest price that we'd offered anybody. But that offer was only in being during the time that I was with them. If I had to walk away without actually doing the papers and signing the deal and giving them the check, the deal was off. And I had to tell them that I was then going to approach the next director and offer him double. And that would continue until the first director went. And then that would be the time when we had won.
Right.
And I did that. I went to see first director on the list for that. And he was quite staggered when he saw the check. But I said, when I leave this room, if we hadn't signed all the papers, this offer goes away and it goes to the next director. And quite frankly, he was sweating blood. He said to me, this money will pay off all of my business debts and make me a very comfortable man for the rest of my life. And I said, well, it's here now, but when I walk through that door, it goes. And he couldn't bring himself because it would mean he would break the goodwill of the other board members.
Yeah.
But he said, I understand the process and I understand eventually somebody will. Well, eventually somebody did, and that was the vice chairman. And he sold. I ended up getting all of his cousins, everybody. And that was it. They did collapse then. And that was the end. But we knew the end was there. So it was when George sold, we knew that we'd won. It was just actually travelling to the winning post. That was the thing.
An amazing story, and one which quite rightly goes down in our history. One more question on that before we move on to what's going on with Newcastle United and the current takeover. Was Kevin Keegan always the first choice as manager?
There's a story that you'll not believe about that.
Go on then, I'm interested.
In my opinion, the most important person during the glory years was a guy called Freddie Fletcher. Freddie Fletcher was a genius, an absolute genius. And he was suggested several times by David, the breweries.
Oh yes, David. Was it Williams? Was it
No,
Williams?
no, David. God, my God, this is an old man's memories going. But anyway, David had suggested that we meet Freddie Fletcher, who had done a fantastic job at Rangers. And I mean, the concentration that we had at that time was just winning the war. And we were in that part where George Dixon shares, we got those, and we were in that part of the territory. And David Secretary rang me one day and said, there's a lunch arranged at Wynyard with David and Sir John and Freddie Fletcher. Can you make it? So I went down for this meeting. We had lots of things going on at the time, but I went down to this meeting and we expected it to be about an hour. We had lunch in the hall, and this character just absolutely knocked me over. This man was the missing piece, and I didn't know that we had any piece missing. He was a genius. David and John had to go off for other things, and me and Freddie sat there for another 2 hours. The guy was a genius. And he invited me and Alan Rooney up to Glasgow, and we went to see what he'd done at Rangers, etc. But we had almost constant contact with Freddie over the next 18 months or so. And after about a couple of months after meeting him, he actually said to me, what do you think of Kevin Keegan? And I said, well, Kevin was just the Messiah when he came. And what he did was phenomenal. And the whole Northeast, feels as strong as that. And he said to me, what about him being manager? And I was staggered because at that time Kevin was playing golf in Spain, and that was the status at the time. And Freddie said, I've met Kevin a couple of times at functions, business promotions, etc. that he's been to, and I've watched the way he goes on. And he says, my gut feeling is this guy would be a great manager. And I thought, wow. So that's where Kevin Keegan's name came into being. But first of all, we had to get Freddie into Newcastle United. So I started work on John then for Freddie coming down for chief executive. And of course then Freddie had to move with his whole family down, which he did. When Freddie, I'll tell you a little story about Freddie. When he came down, and I've already told you how much of a genius he was. He once said to me, the biggest club by a country mile is Man United. Then there's Liverpool. Then there's the Glasgow clubs, and I'm not really sure which is the biggest. And then Newcastle come in with Everton, etc., and Man City. And I smiled at him, and I said, just wait. And he sniggered a little bit. Within a week of him being here, he said, my God, I know why you said that. This is the only club that can match Man U or even overtake it. And he got here and he lived here for a week. So that was the genius. He understood within a few days of living here that the club was ingrained in the whole city and the area. And that is the person that came up with Kevin Keegan. Now, John, on numerous occasions, has said it was Douglas that said yes to Kevin Keegan. And that is correct, but that's technically correct because John was discussing with Freddie Fletcher about what we were going to do because who was the manager then?
Ozzy Ardiles.
Ozzy Ardiles. And they were discussing that. And Freddie said, yeah, but what about Kevin Keegan? And John said, what? So he'd never told John before. So John turned to Douglas and he said, what do you think about Kevin Keegan? And Douglas said, absolutely, let's go for him. And that's, technically, John was right that Douglas did say that. But it was Freddie that had him from the very beginning, long before he actually got here.
Yeah.
And Freddie, because there was three important people in that era, and one was Kevin, one was John, but the other important person was Freddie, because John and Kevin quite often clashed, but Freddie would be able to repair it and keep it going. And it was inevitable that the clashes would happen because John was such a fabulous orator and he would make speeches on the spur of the moment, and they were important speeches because they galvanized people. Everybody really did pick up and carry his enthusiasm. But sometimes he would come out with things and Kevin wouldn't be happy at all. And they were the things and the source of the problems. but Freddie was Mr. Magic. And it was Freddie who put it together, patched it up, and got it moving.
Great memories, John. Great memories. Let's fast forward now to current situations at St James's Park. First question I'd like to ask you is, Mike Ashley's been here 13 years now. It's quite clear that he's now got the club up for sale and intends to leave NE1. What do you make of the way that Mike Ashley has run the football club? And I suppose as a businessman, someone who's been a businessman yourself, I'm not sure if I'm expecting an answer more of support for the way that he's trying to run the club, or whether you're going to speak with a Newcastle United hat on and a fan's hat and criticise him. So I'm interested to hear what you think of the way that he's run the club.
Right. Well, here's my opinion. He's ran the club absolutely brilliant as a business. The problem is, at the very beginning, he got the wrong people in, giving him advice on how to run a football club. And that initial advice has coloured the areas of running a football club as opposed to running a business. That has caused him problems, because if he'd had the right people giving him the right advice, he would have made a phenomenal success of it. For instance, if he'd had Freddie Fletcher as his advisor, there wouldn't have been any of this rubbish. He would have still been sitting with the fans, as he loved it, with his family at the away matches. It was the wrong advice and the wrong people that he got in at the beginning, which has just caused a problem of him continuing. I mean, when you've got a manager like Rafa Benitez asking to have a player that's over 22 but will do the business and will not be financially a liability, that's where his original advice and the themes that went with it caught the problem. And that, unfortunately, is why he's run the club very badly, but the business very well indeed. There are very few, except for the clubs that have got huge resources, that are as well run as a business as ours is. Yeah. And that is a fact. It's not something that you can make an opinion of. It just happens to be a fact. But you've got to add in to running a good business with running a football club. And unfortunately, he's lacked badly on small and very delicate difference that he could have made and made it better.
Oh, that's not Mike Ashley trying to ring you, John.
Say that again?
That Mike Ashley trying to ring you, obviously, you know, the big talking point over this period of COVID and lockdown has been the fact that Mike Ashley has, we're led to believe, sold the club, and we are just waiting for the new owners to be given the green light by the Premier League. Obviously, the people who are looking to purchase the club primarily are the PIF from Saudi Arabia. Amanda Staveley, obviously at PCP, is facilitating the deal, but she will also be 10% shareholder. And the Reuben brothers, who already have connections to the Northeast, will be the other 10% shareholder. What's your views, first and foremost, on PIF and Saudi Arabia being involved? We've seen a lot of negative media towards that. What's your view?
I'm ecstatic. Absolutely ecstatic. That PIF fund has made strategic purchases in businesses all over the world and many in Britain, and always done very well with them. And my personal passion for the club, as every fan has, I can't wait for them to actually get involved. And mixing in Amanda with her track record of being even-handed and well conducted herself so well in the other takeovers she's been involved in, it just tells you a story about the quality of those people. The Reuben brothers, I know less about, although I do know that they're very heavily into the fabric of properties in the city, and that's a very heartening connection in that way as well. I could not be happier with the people that are coming in.
Fantastic. What would you say the priorities are for the new owners, John, when they get here?
They've got to find another Kevin Keegan, and they've got to find there is something that John mistakenly didn't do, and that is to finish the ground, because the ground, unfortunately, does not reflect the stature of the club and its potential as far as gates can be seen. When you've got a 53,000 capacity, you can't get 55 in, 56 or 60. You've got to have the capacity. And John made a mistake, which he's apologised several times. He said we should have started at 50 and then built it up from there, which is the other big grounds in the main is exactly the way that they've been in Europe. Now, fortunately, with this consortium having the funding available, there isn't any restraints on either players or the ground development. No, there isn't any. You can do them both. And this pandemic has even created a little scenario where ground development could be done at 100 miles an hour because we're not allowed to go there yet. And that's an advantage that could be there. Now, when we had the share wars, they've had this directors and owners test, and there's real big questions have got to be asked about this, the people that are overseeing that, and that is something I'm looking forward to see what their explanations are.
Yeah, very, very true. What advice, John, would you give the new owners?
Trust the fans. They'll back you. Just show the ambition. That's what you got to do. If you show Newcastle United fans ambition, they'll be right up your back. Absolutely, without hesitation. And that was the impact that Freddie Fletcher saw. He was only here a few days, and it hit him like a brick. And I would say to Amanda and the others, trust the supporters. They'll come and they will back you. Just show them ambition. That's what they have been waiting for, ambition.
Last question, John. Does Steve Bruce deserve a chance to start next season as head coach, should the takeover go through?
Well, now that question is different to the situation that we had when we got into power. Because Ozzy Ardiles, great, lovely man that he was not a supporter, born and bred with a passion that Steve Bruce has. So there's an element there that I think is important. The question you've got to ask Steve Bruce to answer to himself is, if he was given the resources to go and buy any player that was in the market and that could be acquired, is he confident in his own ability that we would achieve the type of success that Kevin, although we didn't win the silverware, and they have at Liverpool and Man City? Would he be able to do that? Because that's a question more for Steve Bruce to ask Steve Bruce. Because he has the same passion for the club that we have. So an opportunity for him to do it would have to run alongside the honesty that Steve Bruce would have to be able to declare, I'm not up to that standard as a manager. And therein lies a formula somewhere where he would have to come and say, if the chance is given, I can't quite do it the way they can.
Good answer. And obviously time will tell, A, whether the takeover goes through, of course, and B, whether Steve Bruce is still here. But time is ticking on. John, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Thanks for sharing your wonderful memories of, you know, the battle for United, which, as I say, rightly has its place in our beloved club's history. And thanks, I'm sure that if Commander Stevie and co are watching, that they will thoroughly enjoy listening to those memories, but also probably do well to heed your advice. John, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Steve.